I really don't want to turn into Mr. COVID, but I'm being forced to. We're going to discuss a couple of questions and concerns that people have, just so you are aware, because we're going to be using some of this as reference for your colleagues, other people out in different agencies. We're recording it just for reference material. We can't keep doing this, right? So I'm letting you know, I want your questions. I want, whatever comments are still in your mind, because I'm sure if you have them, other people will have them. Please be cognizant of comments you make publicly, okay? So inappropriate comments, all that kind of stuff. I mean, sometimes you're able to in a classroom. Just don't do it over this session, please.
Are you happy with that?
That's perfect.
Okay.
That is perfect. Thank you.
For some reason, you guys pick up pretty easy on the mic.
Oh, I can move that there.
Yeah.
No, you're good.
So
No, I'm saying
I'm going to try and keep this.
Come back a little bit. That's fine.
I'm going to try and cover this over the next 40 minutes. And we're going to go over a basic overview of how the vaccines work, and then some of the concerns that people have, actually most of the concerns around safety and efficacy. Okay. All right, let me just get recording. Oh, great. I'll have to truncate the portion of that video then. So we're going to start by talking about the week's biggest development, which is the approval of the Pfizer vaccine. And the biggest concern that people have around the Pfizer vaccine is, how do I know this is safe enough for me? So we're going to go back to the very basics of the virus, just so you understand what is being targeted by the vaccine. This is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID, okay? There's RNA material inside. That's basically the booklet of instructions that programs the cell, your body cell, when it gets inside, how to make its own sort of housing and machinery. These things outside, these little spikes, the things that give it the name corona, crown, that spike, otherwise known as the spike protein, is what most of all these vaccines target because it seems unique to that virus, okay? That spike is actually how, when the virus gets into your body, that spike attaches to receptors in your body cell, and with that attachment, invades your cells and starts infecting you, okay? So that's really why when people talk about the spike protein and vaccines to spike protein, that's why that protein is such a big deal. So some concerns, some of you forwarded this to me yesterday, there's some of this in the community. Concern number one, I don't want to be among the first to receive a relatively untested vaccine. And we'll talk about how that statement in blue, the relatively untested bit, is not actually accurate. Two, why get a 95% effective vaccine when my immune system is 99.96% effective? I'm dying to know, you're not on video, where does the number 99.96 effective come from? Some of this has been thrown on the internet, but where's that number coming from?
Is it the chance where your body, like the death rate of it is, I think your body is gonna.
Yeah, good. And I wanted to clarify that because I think that's exactly where that number is coming from. This assumes that you have a 0.04% death rate. 0.04. Okay. Actually, the numbers were 0.4 at the beginning, so that number is represented already by a factor of 10. But we'll address that a little further. But thanks for clarifying. I thought that's what it was. Why risk vaccine side effects such as Bell's palsy? I'll address Bell's palsy in a bit. And then I'm concerned with the potential long-term side effects of the vaccine. And so let's talk about what potential long-term side effects could be, not just with this vaccine, but prior vaccines and how we studied those. And then as my family's sole provider, I'm concerned I'll become infected with the virus. And I think that statement refers to, if I get the vaccine, I'm concerned I may get infected from the vaccine. And I'm the sole provider for my family. What do I do? Okay. I want to be very honest with all of you, which is at the beginning of this year, when there was a talk of a vaccine, I was very hesitant. I was hesitant because of the sort of accelerated timeline, and I was concerned that we would rush through the necessary steps for vaccine development. Now, full disclosure here, I am board certified in emergency medicine and EMS. I'm not a vaccinologist. I'm not an infectious disease specialist, but I do have some vaccinology training and advanced training from the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine. They do a ton of sort of outbreak work across the world, immunizations, infectious disease. So I have an understanding of some of this stuff. And because of that, I was a little bit concerned about what the vaccine process would look like. A month ago and 2 weeks ago, if you said, are you ready to take the vaccine? I would have said exactly what the panel of experts on the FDA advisory panel said, which is not until I see the data. I don't care what the company says, and I don't care what governmental institutions say, and I certainly don't care what political institutions say, right? I want to see the science because that's what I know is objectively going to help me, okay? That's where I was 2 weeks ago as well. So my job is not to say, hey, go and get vaccinated, you must get vaccinated. I want to be reasonable so that we have an honest and appropriate discussion around what are the known risks, and then what are these unknown theoretical risks that we talk about, and what are the benefits. This is a virus that has brought the world to its knees. We have changed life as we know it, right? And so we haven't just changed life because it's hurting some people, it's hurting a ton of people. And so we really have to have an honest discussion about what are we balancing here. And let's be honest, vaccine fear is nothing new. This has been going on since the 1800s, right? When Edward Jenner did experiments on cowpox, which he would then use to develop a vaccine for smallpox, all these massive campaigns going around saying you're going to get little cow bits growing out of your body, right? 1980s, DTaP, the diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine in the UK became such a big deal that they had to really fight hard for the next 10 years in the 1980s to really get people to start vaccinating with it again. 1998, something you're much more common with, was when Andrew Wakefield falsely lied about some data he used because of the financial interest involved in it and talked about MMR's link with autism. We still talk about that. And just so you're aware, there is so much science disproving that now. There is so much science that shows MMR and autism. In fact, autism and vaccines are not linked. We almost have stronger science in that area than we do in so many other areas that we practice. And even the Autism Society of America will say there is no credible scientific or medical literature linking the two. And about 90% of parents of children with autism will also say, we do not believe vaccines cause autism because there is such good science behind it. So think of all these vaccines you've taken in your childhood, and I want you to think about the process that's used in evaluating whether A, they're effective, and then two, there's safety data. And by the end of this talk, I'm going to give you a view that the safety process used for this vaccine for COVID really isn't any different than that other than one particular area. So we have two leading developers right now, Pfizer and Moderna, and I'm going to stick to just these two to make the discussion more relevant. We knew about vaccine structure and its need for development way back when SARS came out, and then when MERS came out afterwards. And that's where a lot of this research came from. MERS was Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. There was a ton of developmental science into this, but it never really came to fruition, and nobody really threw money at it because it didn't bring the world down to its knees, right? It kind of contained itself and went away. In this case, what typically happens is you have this sort of preclinical development, which means animals, and then you go to phase 1, 2, and 3, which is humans. You start with looking at safety, looking at doses, and then a combination of safety and doses. And then you seek licensure. And once you get licensure, then you go, I'm going to now reach out to the companies that help me do large-scale production. I need millions of vials, which are made of glass, which have plastic tops, and the containers for those vials, labels, all this raw material for packaging, shipping, all that happens after licensure. Given the importance of this vaccine, that all started right when the development was kicked off. So we don't have those months of delay from that aspect, okay? And the biggest part of this is that the government actually threw money at the manufacturers to take away the risk. So just so you understand how big of a role money plays in this, it typically costs $1 billion just to start from the preclinical right to licensure. The most expensive aspect of that is what we call phase 3, where you have tens of thousands of people, and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars that phase because of the amount of time, resources, and energy you need to actually perform these studies. And these studies, by the way, are not 2-page papers that get reported. They're hundreds of pages of scientific paper that have to be reviewed to look at every little participant who was in there. And so the government basically put money out to say, we're going to assume the risk. You don't have to assume risk as a pharmaceutical company. Go ahead and do these experiments. And even if you fail, we won't ask you to pay us back. But if you succeed and you give us something that's safe and effective, well, then you get onto the market, right? This is like buying a home. It can take a long time to save up the money to put on a down payment. But if somebody just takes care of your down payment, right, now you are almost immediately able to identify home as long as you've saved up for the mortgage payment, right? Mortgage payment's still yours, but I'm giving you an analogy of how much of the risk is taken away from that stage. And so it's the same process used to license all prior vaccines. The timeline has been compressed because money, hate to say it, money makes it happen. And then these are parallel, not sequential processes. A lot of it started together. And we'll talk a little bit more about that again. This graphic, when I share it, for some reason turns around. I'm sorry about that. The point of this was to show you that what happens is you get emergency use authorization, then there's a separate committee, advisory committee on immune practices. They look at it, then they take it to the CDC, and then the CDC takes it down to the states. In our case, because there were concerns about potential political interference with the process, California in particular set up its own work group with a vaccine composed of experts in the field to say, if we look at the same data that the FDA is looking at, are we going to come to the same conclusion? Because we want to make sure that Californians can trust this process, right? We don't want them to assume that something was done centrally from the federal government and that there's any risk of foul play in this. So in order to understand this, let's talk a little bit about emergency use authorization. You guys have heard a ton about EUAs, okay? And what's really important to understand about an EUA is an EUA for a drug or a medical therapy is not the same as an EUA for a vaccine. And the reason being is when you're talking about making a medication, you're making it for people who've already got that disease who are sick, right? And their risk of a bad outcome from that disease can be pretty high. When you're talking about a vaccine, you're talking about giving something to somebody who hasn't got that disease, i.e. you have a relatively safer person with a lower risk. And so if you're going to give them something, you have to be really careful about how much risk and safety you assume in that process. Does that make sense? Right? One requires much more safety evaluation, much more robust safety evaluation, in this case, the vaccine, because you're giving it to uninfected people without the disease, presumably. So when you talk about EUAs for vaccines, okay, it's the same 3 phases in an EUA as it would be for normal non-EUA vaccines. And EUAs came about after 9/11, after the anthrax attacks, and people realized we need a really quick way of making some of these things without the sort of paperwork stopping us, okay? The only difference is there isn't much animal testing involved in EUAs, but the reality is we do animal testing because most humans don't step up to the plate and go, hey, test me, right? So if we know it works in humans, that's the surest way of knowing something works. It's usually when we see something work in animals, or we see something that looks like it's safe in animals, then we take it to humans and we notice there are all these sort of side effects that pop up. Or actually it's not that effective, that throws us into a wrench. This is the opposite. So EUA versus normal process, the basic step, we said same number of trials, 2 months minimum of safety data, and I'll talk about that. We'll recircle to that 2 months again. And then there's usually a period about 6 to 12 months after the vaccine phase 3 trial happens, where you kind of look and see what happens in those 6 months before you go ahead and release the vaccine. And so EUA vaccines tend to skip this period. And this is what most people are freaking out about right now, which is we don't have that 6 to 12 month period in which to figure out what's going on, right? That's fair, we don't. And when you start giving people millions of doses of vaccine, you're bound to start seeing a couple of things. But what's really important to understand, and I want to be able to emphasize, is that safety period is not the high yield period where we find stuff out. The critical period, right? This current vaccine is skipping that, but the critical period really is where those 2 months after every participant in a study has received their trial, those 2 months that follow are the critical period. You can ask me why. Before I get to that, I want you to think about something you get on a regular basis, the flu vaccine. Every year you take a flu vaccine. We think it's important enough because of the amount of morbidity, i.e. disease it causes, where people need to be hospitalized. In general, and this is 2008, but before then there used to be hundreds of people enrolled in this trials. Now we're lucky we have thousands, up to 8 to 9, sometimes 10,000 people who get tested for the efficacy of the flu vaccine. And the vaccine doesn't go through a 1-year study process. It sometimes goes through 6 months, because we look at what's happening in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, etc., And once we get a strain, we make something, and it has to be made in the time for you and I to be able to take it. And if we wait 6 months, we're never going to get a vaccine. Okay? And I'm not going to entertain discussions about the flu vaccine now. A lot of people say, well, the flu vaccine doesn't work. Well, the reality is, when you make a flu vaccine that approximates the real influenza so closely, you end up getting nasty side effects, right? There's not, you get sick from flu, you just get nasty side effects. People don't want to take it. And so there's a little bit of risk of getting too close. But I want you to use flu as an example of something you're familiar with. So let's first talk about how this vaccine works, and then we'll talk about some of the safety issues again. So the key is you have something called replication. We've talked about SARS-CoV-2 as a virus, and that virus contains genetic material inside it. And different portions of that genetic material program for different things. So there's this portion here, which programs for that spike protein that we said that it uses to attach to your cells. What they do in the lab is they basically have these nucleosides readily available. It's basically the code for genetic material, and they have it available. And so they program that spike protein material for that RNA for that spike protein. They make a whole bunch of copies. And then RNA is, unlike DNA, it's really, really wimpy. It's very labile, it's very fragile, which is why you have to transport it at sub-zero, sometimes subarctic temperatures to keep it stable. So you coat it in this kind of fat lipid molecule, and then it goes into surge. And a lot of times what happens is when you see this, the side effects that you see are not really from that, but what you're transporting it in, okay? Like any medication we use, we have stabilizers or preservatives in medications, and they tend to give side effects. We'll talk about that a bit more. So now you've got this RNA vaccine, and it gets injected in your body, okay? This is a DNA vaccine. I'm just showing it to you for comparison. Don't focus on that. Focus on the RNA vaccine. It gets injected in, and it gets taken up by cells. In this case, the muscle cells it gets injected into. And then sometimes that RNA molecule, that mRNA that's coated in that fat, also goes up to your lymph cells. Remember, the lymph cells are part of your immune system, right? They're the worker bees of keeping you protected and safe from infection. So that goes into your cell, it binds with the cell, and then it's released out here in something called the cytoplasm, that sort of liquid area where there's a lot of work going on. It never, ever enters the nucleus. It has no way of entering the nucleus as RNA. At this level, it's not worth me talking about some of these theoretical risks that are brought about by reverse transcription, all this other fancy stuff that could interact with the nucleus. That just doesn't happen with RNA. Okay, so when we talk about genetic material infusing, it's not really a theoretical possibility. Once it gets in the cytosol, there's something called the ribosome, which is the sort of machinery of the cell, right? This is that very basic cell physiology you guys got bored about week number 1, which takes RNA, looks at the instructions, make protein. So your cells look at this, they make these proteins, and in this case, it's going to be the spike protein, and they make a whole bunch of copies. They just make a whole bunch of copies, and these spike proteins stick around inside the cell. There's no virus being made, just that protein, so you're not getting infected with anything. And then that cell just naturally dies. And as that cell dies, it releases all these spike proteins around your system, around your body. Those proteins get picked up by cells in your body. They're called antigen-presenting cells, and they take them to different parts. T cells, B cells, T cells do like direct killing. B cells make antibodies that do indirect killing. And this is how you mount an immune response, okay? And so sometimes you see in these studies, they talk about a lymph node getting slightly swollen up in a few people. Well, when you get a cold or a cough and you go to the doctors, what do we sometimes do? We feel for a little bit of a lymph node. Just tells me your lymph nodes are active and working. On most infections, that's pretty benign, okay? The key thing to remember is that these spike proteins are not going to stick around the body. They're not expected to, according to the studies, stick around longer than those 14 days, which is the time it takes to mount your immune response. They get destroyed off that because of the T cells and B cells. So that sounds like fancy technology, and let's revisit safety. Safety is a relative concept, and it's almost ironic that we're talking about it in this room because the line of work that all of you do is not safety. You're safety personnel, but there's nothing safe about your line of work. However, you still have processes that you implement and you use on a daily basis to ensure that you are doing things as safely as possible, right? You're not avoiding it, you're mitigating risk. It's almost impossible to have zero risk in this world. You get in a car, there's nothing zero risk about that. And so what I want you, what I hope we can do is look at this from a standpoint of relative safety. What are the risks of disease with COVID? Okay, and what it's done for life to us, and then how do we look at the known risks of vaccine, and then all these theoretical unknown risks that we don't know about. We want to be able to quantify that so we're having the same discussion. When we talk about safety data, these are reputable experts, people who I trust, who are physicians. They don't work full-time for the FDA. They actually work as investigators at various hospitals in the country, and they're they're brilliant people. And all of them unanimously felt, based on what I'm going to show you in just a bit, that 2 months of follow-up data in these studies after the participants were given the vaccine, that's how much data they looked at, 2 months, that was adequate to be able to justify safety in these vaccines, okay? And to most people, when you look at 2 months of safety data, you go, this doesn't sound right, just doesn't sound like enough. And I understand that, okay? And so the question is that enough? And if we look historically at what we call these occasional side effects, these rare side effects from vaccines that are serious, okay? Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending paralysis that sometimes happens with certain vaccines, viscerotrophic disease, which is a multi-organ failure, polio, which is polio, narcolepsy, a disorder of wakefulness, right? People just go into the sleep mode, or thrombocytopenia, low platelet counts. Are 2 months of data enough to claim safety when we know these kinds of things happen in what people sometimes mistakenly call long-term effects, right? Is 2 months enough to look at this? And so this is a really, really, really important graph to take a look at, this table, rather. When we look at polio from the oral polio vaccine, not something you guys would get because you get injectable polio here, it happens in about 1 in 2.4 million people. When you look at Guillain-Barré syndrome from influenza, it's thought to happen in about 1 in a million people. Now, a couple of caveats. When you get influenza, you can also get Guillain-Barré just from actually having the flu at a rate that is much higher than this. So the flu actually puts you at a higher rate of Guillain-Barré, but I'm not even going into that. I'm just sticking to the vaccines. One would assume that for me to know if this is happening in any of the vaccine participants, I'd have to give 1 million doses to see that I'm not getting 1 case of this. And probabilistically, statistically, that makes sense. But in 70 years of vaccine history, when we look at these conditions, they were all discovered within a time frame of 2 months. And this is why that 2-month mark is used. In all these different conditions used. And there was a broad panel of 50 scientists at the FDA and the CDC. And again, these are not full-time, employees who work for those agencies. They act as experts advising those committees. Not a single one of them could think of any rare, serious side effect from a vaccine that had been discovered in trials that was discovered after that 2-month period. Now, I'm completely okay being wrong, and we'll find something in another couple of months. I'm okay with that, right? But what I'm trying to get at is if I take the science and the evidence that has been presented, I'm pretty sure, for me, this represents 2 months as being good enough, and that's why that cutoff is used, right? Just as you talk about transport time for certain conditions, whether it's trauma or STEMI, we use those numbers because the science shows us those numbers as being the best estimates for some outcome. And when the science drastically changes, we'll change those numbers. But we don't do that. We don't do that every time we see that condition. We don't question it every time. So 1 month ago, I'll tell you, like I said, I was skeptical myself. The FDA's own advisory board was skeptical, saying we're not going to either approve or even take the vaccine ourselves until we see the data. Because once you see the data, you look at the science, you can say, maybe this is safe. So maybe now you'll see that this timeline is actually safe. But what about just doing the other thing that people talk about, which is natural immunity? Why not just wait for natural immunity? In fact, most of you are young, you're mostly healthy. The majority of you probably won't die. So why not just let COVID happen? Let's take your families out of this, because we know for a fact that when you get sick, there's a huge chance that the rest of your families get sick, and that's a whole different risk equation. But is COVID-19 safer than the vaccine? The death rate of 0.04% that was being touted, that was false, because even at the beginning we had said it was 0.4%, but let's say it was 0.4%, the real number. The death rate right now in the United States and in California is 1.2%. That doesn't sound like much. But if every day you guys drove, and out of 100 of you, one of you is going to die, I guarantee you're going to think 3 times about getting into that car, right? That's a huge death rate. And compare that to the usual 0.05% death rate for last year's influenza season from the CDC, right? That's a 25-fold difference. Okay, fine. Maybe I'm not afraid of dying. Let's talk about some of these things that COVID-19 causes that we don't talk about because we're still so focused on getting it under control. Let's talk about some of these longer term, less common things that we don't talk about, especially in this environment, because it's something that a lot of clinicians have to do on a follow-up basis, on an inpatient basis, et cetera. Let's talk about what people call the long haulers, some of these subtle things. One of the most prominent things we've come to find out is this concept of vasculitis, right? Vasculitis is an immune-mediated phenomenon in which your body attacks endothelial cells. Endothelial cells line all the blood vessels in your body. And so you're basically you're attacking these arteries that are going out and just, supplying all these different organs. This is why we're seeing evidence of stroke in patients that have having COVID. This is why we're seeing myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. This is why we're seeing kidney failure. This is why we're seeing these weird rashes, right? And that's just stuff that we're looking for because we're still unable to keep up with the number of people sick and pretty much using up our hospitals and our ICUs to capacity. So vasculitis is one big. Cardiomyopathy, the thing that causes damage to the function of the heart, such that it's no longer producing the kind of output of function you'd expect. Therefore, things like heart failure, etc. In young people, okay? In some people, COVID actually makes your bodies make antibodies to something called interferon. Our body has interferon because it helps us mount an immune response. And COVID is making antibodies to this. Just last week, people were shocked when they saw a report that said men have almost 3 to 4 times worse outcomes than women in COVID. And that's because men are producing these antibodies against interferon at a much higher rate than women are, right? And these are things we're barely beginning to learn, but it's definitely a significant phenomenon that's affecting young people without any other underlying medical conditions. Chronic brain fog, people with for 6 months of, I'm just not feeling myself, I just feel off, I'm not quite thinking as quick as I would like to. And then prolonged loss of smell and taste, right? This doesn't sound like much, but if you have a loss of smell and taste for 4, 5, 6 months, even if it's 2 months, it really affects just your day-to-day life. And there's nothing normal about that. There really no other viruses that we know of that do it on such a profound level. So the question is, this is the kind of thing we're seeing with the disease, right? Not just death. And what do we know about the vaccine in the 2 months of safety data we have so far? None of this kind of stuff. We're not seeing these kinds of side effect profiles on the vaccine at all. And that's not to say nothing will surface, but it's to say based on what we've done historically, based on the fact that we've done the same thing for this vaccine, based on what we know about the disease, is it worth playing around with these theoretical unknowns about what could happen with the vaccine? The other thing that comes up is, well, this is an mRNA vaccine. We've never quite used something like this before. And that's partly true. We haven't quite used it on this scale in a vaccine. mRNA technology isn't new. So mRNA vaccine trials have been carried out in the past, influenza, rabies, something called CMV, cytomegalovirus, Zika. And it never really came to fruition because there were a lot of challenges in those trials. They tried to find a way of making it more stable. They tried to find a way of delivering a more effective dose. But that's learning. That's what happens in science. You make mistakes, they don't quite work out, and then you refine it, and you finally get to a better product. And that's the result. I mean, this vaccine is a result of some of that happening. But mRNA has been used in a lot of cancer medicine. We'll talk a little bit about that down the road, especially gastric cancer. The benefits and the reason we're just not surprised that mRNA is the first vaccine to come out is because it's quick to produce in the lab. It's easy to scale up. You don't have to wait for the virus to multiply, grow it in something, wait for 1 billion copies. You just sit there and use sort of this biotechnology that's very easily available to create these mRNA copies. And so it's not surprising that we're able to mass produce this so quickly. I'm going to ignore that graphic. The point of just putting this slide up is we talk about the influenza trials and 10,000 people in them every year to look at efficacy. This particular vaccine from Pfizer is looking at 44,000 participants. Moderna has 37,000, right? So we're using a much larger number of people to look for smaller differences. The claim that was made was 95% effective beginning a week after your second dose. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but the key thing to remember when we're talking about efficacy is if I take the vaccine, it's effective if it prevents me with a 95% chance, right, of developing disease. I could still get infected. I may be infected enough to still pass on the infection to somebody else, which is what happens now anyway. But the key is to stop the recognizable disease, because the disease is what's causing all those sort of long-term effects, and in particular, the death. And the second thing that people talk about is, well, I don't even know how long the protection is going to last for. Some of the trials say it's only been 90 days, 3 months. I don't want to get a vaccine that's every 3 months. The truth is, we don't know, right? SARS-CoV-2 is a single-strand RNA virus. Another single-strand RNA virus, like measles, has been used in the same vaccine has been used since the 1960s. We haven't had to change that once, and you guys still get that today as the MMR vaccine. And then influenza, which is another single-strand RNA virus, changes every minute. It mutates and shifts and then causes something called antigenic drift. And so it's hard to predict, but given that the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself hasn't had any major shifts that are happening month to month to month, we don't think that's likely going to happen. But again, the point is to be able to let time tell that question, and not to have to refuse a vaccine based on the fact that it may shift in 6 months or a year. Most experts, far smarter than me and people who do vaccinology, estimate it could be 1 to 2 years of minimum efficacy. And to me, that's good enough, because that's kind of what we do with flu. Okay. So when we talked about efficacy and I said it decreases clinical disease, that means it protects you. You still could transmit it to others, which means when you get your vaccine, you don't go home, you don't go do high risk activity, go home and go, my family's fine, I've been vaccinated. And you kind of take lapse of precautions around them. You still need to use PPE, because we don't know which 5% of you will get disease and will transmit to others on a significant level, okay? And then this question of how long immunity lasts, the truth is these studies were never designed to look at it. You have to ask questions in scientific studies in a very particular way and design the trial to answer that question. A lot of people make interpretations of different scientific data, but if you don't ask the question correctly and design your study to target that question, you kind of lose the point of the study to some degree. I'm going to skip over Moderna. So I'm going to talk about something called reactogenicity, which is what happens, what are these sort of expected side effects you get from these vaccines. And the most common ones that we've talked about, or that have been touted, is fever, fatigue, headache, and then myalgias is muscle aches, arthralgias, joint aches. Really the most common ones you see are just that fatigue, the most common one, and then headache. And the point of saying this is, these are mostly mild to moderate. They don't, they're not severe enough to get you into the hospital. They usually last about 1 day and no more than 2, but they're meaningful enough where you may have to take a day off work or so. Okay, most of the studies will say that it affects about 10 to 20% of people, but that number came from what is called prompting adverse effects. So if I gave you a medication and I called you every day and prompt you to say, are you having any chills? Are you having any aches? You're going to say yes to that. What matters to us, and what LA County Department of Public Health is doing, is using a lower estimate of 5% based on the studies showing that actual self-reporting, right? Which means I give you a vaccine and then you call me when your adverse effect, your side effect feels miserable enough to you, where it interferes with you going to work or you going out of the house and going to the store or things like that. And that we think is where the 5% sort of number of people getting this vaccine are going to be affected. It's worse off the second dose, because the first dose, remember, tends to prime your immune system, just kind of gets it ready for the response. And the second dose actually amplifies the response. And it's much more common in younger people, because as you get older, your immune system tends to forget some of the infections it hasn't been exposed to for a while. And so you get this thing called senescence. Now, you guys are going to be seeing a lot of this, either by getting vaccinated or people who get vaccinated and then call for help. These are the symptoms we expect you get after vaccination. But if you develop these symptoms, cough, shortness of breath, sore throat, loss of smell or taste, or runny nose within the 2 days after getting a vaccine, That's probably not the vaccine. That could be somebody who's showing signs or symptoms of COVID itself, right? So you want to be careful about not blowing off those symptoms. I'm going to take a quick 2 seconds and talk about fever. We talk a lot about fever and managing fever, and we do this in the hospital and the emergency departments an awful lot, and we have this fever phobia that is actually dangerous, and it's something that we have to, as a system, work towards getting away from. Treating fever can actually prolong or worsen illness. There's a long-held misconception that viruses or bacteria die more quickly at higher temperatures. I've been faulty of that assumption myself. But really the truth is that our immune system works better at a higher temperature. And what we mean is that these B cells that make antibodies more efficiently at that higher temperature. And neutrophils, which are a type of white blood cells, go and actually kill bacteria. They localize and kill them in the body more efficiently at that temperature. And studies have repeatedly shown in animals, in humans, over 30 years that giving people anti-fever medications, antipyretics, makes them do worse. They do worse because they get more severe symptoms and they get longer symptoms. And in the vaccine world, this matters because if you just take Tylenol every time you get a little bit of a fever after the vaccine, or you just preemptively take it being like, I think I'm going to get a fever tomorrow, let me just take some Tylenol Motrin now, you're blunting that response actually decreases the immune response you're supposed to get from that vaccine. I can give you 20 papers on this, and it's unfortunate because we use fever as a measure in hospital departments, and every time a patient has a fever, even if they look great, we just end up giving them Tylenol or Motrin, and we shouldn't. If they're miserable, sure, we should treat them, but if they're not, and we're giving them these medications, or you're doing that for your children or families, we're actually hurting them, and this is a big deal. So let's be evidence-based, right? There is evidence that fever improves outcomes for infections, and of note, there's no evidence that treating fevers actually helps people. So let's just stick to the evidence. Now, this is a big deal because a decent number of people will get fevers after these vaccines, and there's good guidance to say, don't just treat them preemptively, but if they're miserable, go ahead and advise them to take either Tylenol, some sort of NSAID like Motrin, Advil, etc. You've all heard about this allergic reaction that came about from the 2 participants in the UK, not participants, but people who received the vaccine in the UK. And the UK, unfortunately, went a little far and just said anyone with a history of anaphylaxis should not get the vaccine, right? And truthfully, the guidance is a little bit more accurate here based on what was investigated off those two participants and developed an allergic reaction is if you have an allergy, a documented allergy to the components in the vaccine, and there are a lot of components there, there's a lot more specific guidance to this, but the one that I've kind of put in green here, polyethylene glycol, part of that fatty substance molecule for transport, extremely common in injectable medications. So sometimes people will get a medication and they'll react and they'll say, oh, I have an allergy to that medication, but a different form of that same medication they won't react to. And it's because of that sort of carrying chemical molecule, polyethylene glycol, that they actually had a reaction to. And so food, specifically food and environmental allergies, don't seem to do this to people, right? And we do the same with influenza. We'll say for the type of influenza vaccine that's grown in chicken eggs, we'll say if you have an allergy to eggs, don't take this, right? There are other options for you in terms of flu vaccine. We don't just say if you have any allergy to anything on this planet, don't take the vaccine, right? It's kind of a misguided concept. And the difference is if you do have an allergy and you choose to take this vaccine, one, consult the person who's actually giving that vaccine, but 2, recognize that they may ask you to stick around a little bit longer. Instead of being watched for 15 minutes to make sure you don't have any effects, they keep you for 30 minutes, right? Most of all vaccines given to you, you're always asked to wait around. I think some places tend to let that slide a little bit, but really the general rule is no matter whether or not you have allergies, you're always supposed to wait about 15 minutes to watch for any symptoms that develop. So the question is, if I've had COVID, or if I have COVID now, should I get the vaccine? And the recommendation is really just wait 90 days. And the 90-day wait has nothing to do with safety or whether the vaccine is effective. It's just, we know if you have COVID, you're probably going to have protection for about 90 days. And we have so much more demand right now than we do supply of the vaccine. So we're just giving your colleagues a chance to get protected while you still have that protection from that recent infection. If you're currently infected, the reason you don't get to do it is we just don't want to increase unnecessary exposure. If you have COVID right now, there's no need for me to come and vaccinate you and expose myself to you because it's not going to change management. You'll probably have some protection for 90 days anyway, and we don't want to increase our risk of doing that. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's not a safety issue whatsoever. In post-vaccinated patients, this is not going to apply to you guys. I do this with some of the other emergency departments. You don't have to be off work. If you develop a fever, you probably should be, but you can probably be off for a couple of days and then go back to work as long as your symptoms resolve. So Bell's palsy. In this trial, there were 4 cases of Bell's palsy that arose in the vaccine group and then nothing in that placebo group. And so, of course, that rate always makes people go, what's going on here? When investigators looked at this, and not investigators, when the experts looked at the data on this, the experts on the panel agreed that this was pretty much the number of cases in which it arose is pretty much the rate at which it tends to be expected in the general population, right? If something happens at the rate we expect it to happen, it's not considered an unexpected or an adverse event. And the truth about this vaccine is we probably have a more robust surveillance system with this vaccine than we've had with any other one. So when you go get your shot, they can ask you to scan something on your app, on your phone. They'll send you a text message every day for the first week, and then a week after that, and then a couple of weeks after that, then a month after that. And so that people are reporting these symptoms because there'll be a lot of people who report a lot of symptoms. Some of them may be symptoms because they actually picked up COVID, before actually getting the vaccine, 2 days before. They just weren't symptomatic at that point. And so we want to be able to differentiate what are the symptoms that people feel versus the symptoms from the vaccine. Just to give you an idea, there are a lot of people who had headache, fatigue, myalgias from getting the vaccine, but there were about half as many people in the placebo group who reported those exact same side effects, right? So placebo sometimes isn't just placebo because people associate or think they may have gotten something, or they may have gotten something else and they just attribute it to the vaccine itself. So it's the way in which we look at that scientific data that really matters, right? If it's happening at the same rate in both groups, it's probably not relevant. Pregnancy right now, the recommendation is, you should get it because pregnant people do poorly with COVID. They have a higher rate of preterm births. They have a higher rate of going to the ICU, but really there's no safety data, and I don't want to expand on that, but that's just a choice for people to make of their own. And then for people who have immunocompromising conditions, their immune system isn't quite robust. They can be offered the vaccine, but just recognize when you're immunocompromised, your immune system doesn't function the way it's supposed to, and so you may just not make as many antibodies or have the level of protection you should, and so it's dangerous for immunocompromised people to get a vaccine, think it works great for them, and then they go around without taking precautions. That's a risk to them. So, couple of myths, couple of facts, and I'm going to tell you about something at the end that we haven't touched on. So, COVID-19 vaccine will stop you from getting or spreading COVID-19, and that's not true. It stops you from getting clinical disease, as we said, right? The point is to stop you going to the hospital and, more importantly, stop you dying. We did that with influenza. When we give you influenza vaccine, we don't say you will never get influenza with it. Everyone always complains, oh, the vaccine didn't work, I still got sick. The question is, did you get sick enough to go to the hospital? Did you die from it? And some people will, no matter what. Some people have unexpected outcomes. Some people have predictable adverse outcomes. But if we look at people who got the vaccine and people who didn't, and there was a massive difference in the number of people actually needing to be hospitalized and dying, that's the outcome that matters. We're not trying to protect society from ever getting sick. We're trying to protect it from those untoward events. Transmission I've talked about, we don't know about whether it stops you from transmitting or not at this point, so we'll have to see. The process of vaccine development is rushed. Hopefully, based on that timeline study I showed you at the beginning, it's pretty much the same as every other vaccine we have, except for that 6-month observation period. But the critical period is that 2-month observation. And this is why they pushed really hard to fight any political pressure that said this vaccine needs to be developed before election day, right? And that was, honestly, for people who are in the scientific community, it was a big deal to say, no, we need to not rush anything and wait for that mandated 2-month period, because we know that 2-month period shows us adverse outcomes. It shows us when things go wrong with vaccines. So it wasn't rushed, and it certainly wasn't haphazard. There have not been any prior mRNA vaccines used in humans. That's true, there haven't been any used in humans, but mRNA technology is not new. There are a lot of different cancer medications and drugs and therapeutics that use this, There's something called transthyretin, a very rare disorder called transthyretin amyloidosis. That's a debilitating progressive neurological disease. mRNA medication is used for that. And so it's not a completely novel technology. It's been developed almost 30 years ago and has been used for at least a decade and a half. RNA vaccines can implant material into the human genome or fundamentally change a human's genetic structure. We've just mentioned earlier on, RNA does not interact with DNA at all, does not interact with the nucleus, and so that's just not possible. And ill effects from the vaccines won't be seen for months or years, and there will always be a couple of effects we may not know about until millions of doses are out there. We can accept that as fact. I'm not trying to prove to you that this is a perfect process. I don't have any interest in doing that other than your safety and the safety of our workforce as a team. But hopefully what I've been able to impress upon you is the fact that in these months and years after the vaccine is released, the information we get does not tend to drastically change anything we know about that vaccine. It's rare and has almost never happened in history where we get these vaccines and we find out about something deadly that happened 6 months later that we now have to pull the vaccine off the market. Okay, you can mention vaccines and we'll talk about when those timelines happen, if it helps reassure you. But I think it's important to know that there's some unknowns there compared to the known risks of COVID beyond death, compared to the known safety profile, compared to the fact that it has gone through the same process of approval as all these other vaccines we take, bar that small period, which may not be very significant. So if you get vaccinated, what happens to PPE? Nothing. We continue for now because in order for your PPE to come off, a significant number of the population has to be vaccinated. And when that happens, we will have developed some herd immunity. And then at that point, we'll have enough data to also show whether we've decreased transmission between one another because of the vaccine, right? Until then, you may get COVID or may get infected. You may not have disease because you took the vaccine, you're protected, but you may be shedding some virus and you end up going home. You don't want to inadvertently pass it to yourselves or others. There's some things we talk about in terms of vaccine adverse effects, and sometimes we forget to talk about the benefit of vaccine beyond just, hey, you're protected from a disease. I'll give you an example, measles. We don't see very much of it in the United States except for little outbreaks at Disneyland. And it's not until recently we were able to really scientifically look at something that measles does. When measles infects people, we think of, oh, measles gives you pneumonia and it gives you some problems in the brain, something called encephalitis, which is a brain infection. And in fact, we find out that what measles actually does when it gets into your immune system, it hits your immune system hard enough that all these programmed memory cells you stored in the immune system based on prior infections you've had and you've developed an immunity to, measles makes those cells forget how to produce those antibodies and some of that immune protection mechanism. So by getting measles, you go backwards in time because you lose that innate sort of immune response. And one of the things we forget to talk about then is sometimes vaccines, which prevent that, not just the disease, but those kinds of effects from happening, have a huge take on your immune system, right? It's not just protecting you against that one disease, it's protecting you against multiple diseases, which have also been programmed into your body just through life. I know it sounds like scientific nuance, but I'm afraid to simplify this because I think we have overcomplicated the risks associated with vaccines, especially as a healthcare workforce, and that worries me to some level. So don't hesitate, vaccinate, but let's start having real, reasonable discussions about problems with vaccines and hesitation based on the science and the data, and not things we're seeing in the news or social media. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll start taking some questions here in just a second.